Welcome to the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA, introductory course titled Environmental Permits, provided by the Florida Department of Transportation's Office of Environmental Management. This is the second session of FDOT's Environmental Permits training and will focus on the procedural aspects of permitting. While the first part of this training provided an overview of the Permit Handbook and environmental permitting as a whole, this training is based on FDOT's Permit Handbook and supplemented with information from the Project Development and Environment, or PD&E Manual. Please note, links to references mentioned in this training will be provided on the last slide. This training was designed for FDOT districts and the Florida Turnpike staff, their consultants, and their associated offices. Please note that you may pause this training at any time. Part 2 of this training includes 4 lessons that build on the overview of environmental permitting found in Part 1. In Part 1, we went through the first 4 lessons. In Lesson 5, we will discuss procedures during the efficient transportation decision-making process. In Lesson 6, we will discuss procedures during the planning phase and project development and environment study. In Lesson 7, we will discuss procedures during the design and permitting phase. And in Lesson 8, we will discuss procedures during the construction phase. Lesson 5 will provide a brief overview of the project delivery process and introduce the Efficient Transportation Decision-Making, or ETDM screening. To learn more about these processes, refer to the PD&E Manual and Environmental Management Training Academy PD&E Training, Track 3, and the Etdm Manual and associated trainings in the Etdm Process Training, Track 7. The need to obtain a permit is determined by the amount of proposed environmental impacts, regardless of the environmental document. FDOT identifies permits when impacts are known through the planning phase, the PD&E study, or in the design phase for projects with minimal or no impacts. Projects that are screened in the Efficient Transportation Decision-Making, or ETDM process, typically go through a PD&E study to assess alternatives and project impacts before the design phase. Permits anticipated to be needed are identified in environmental document, as well as the technical documents such as a natural resources evaluation or cultural resource assessment survey, and are generally acquired during the design phase. While less impactful projects without a PD&E study can begin with the design phase, the required permits are identified during the development of the design scope of services. There are 3 federal class of actions defined in 23 CFR Section 771.115, which establish the level of documentation required in the NEPA process. The first is an Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, which applies to actions that significantly affect the environment. The second is a Categorical Exclusion, or CE. This class of action applies to actions that do not individually or cumulatively have a significant environmental effect. The last is an Environmental Assessment, or EA. This class of action is assigned to actions in which the significance of environmental impact is not clearly established. More information on class of actions can be found in Part 1, Chapter 2 of the PD&E Manual and the computer-based NEPA introductory course, Class of Action. State-funded PD&E studies for highway projects are documented in the form of a State Environmental Impact Report, or SEER, rather than a federal NEPA document. Non-major state actions are only prepared when FDOT is the lead agency and the project does not require a PD&E study. Non-major state actions require an environmental evaluation and completion of the non-major state action checklist. To learn more, see Part 1, Chapter 10 of the PD&E Manual. The Efficient Transportation Decision-Making, or ETDM process, provides agencies and other stakeholders the opportunity for early input and consideration of the environment in FDOT transportation planning. In the ETDM process, interaction is accomplished through an Environmental Technical Advisory Team, or ETAT. This includes representatives from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Coast Guard, Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, water management districts, and others. ETAP members use the Environmental Screening Tool, or EST, to review project information, review preliminary alternatives, identify potential project effects, and submit comments to FDOT. There are two Etdm screening events in the EST, the planning screen and the programming screen. The Etdm planning screen is an early review that typically occurs prior to a project being selected to the 5-year work program. Often conducted by planning staff at metropolitan planning organizations, counties, and even district staff, the planning screen is a project sponsor's preliminary attempt to address consistency with local plans while considering the input of agencies and other stakeholders. Refinements to project scope and description may result. The Etdm programming screen is required for all qualifying projects that will be included or are already included in the 5-year work program, but have not yet started the PD&E study. The screening looks deeper into anticipated project effects and agency coordination, which then assists appropriate project scoping for the PD&E study. FDOT uses information obtained during the screening events to focus on the issues that should be addressed during PD&E. More detailed information on this process can be found in FDOT's Etdm Manual. At the beginning of the Etdm process, FDOT develops a preliminary environmental discussion called a PED, which is sent to the ETAT through the screening event. The PED provides ETAT with preliminary information on resource involvement, anticipated permitting requirements, and potential mitigation options. The ETAT inputs into their screening tool their comments on the preliminary information provided by FDOT. The permit coordinator may be asked by the Etdm coordinator to review information in the PED, as well as compile an initial list of permits that may be required for the project based on their anticipated project impacts. Coordination between the Etdm coordinator, project manager, permit coordinator, environmental office, and ETAT should be continuous throughout the Etdm process. The planning screen generates documentation and support information that facilitates the identification of permits anticipated to be needed. A list of anticipated permits can be found within the Anticipated Permits section of the planning screen. If a planning screen was conducted, the programming screen builds upon the information from the planning screen. ETAT members may confirm a list of anticipated permits from the PED or identify additional permits that may be needed. Permits identified by the ETAT members are recorded in the Anticipated Permits section of the programming screen summary report. ETAT reviews help to identify anticipated permits or confirm permits identified in the PED, recommend strategies to minimize environmental impacts, recommend strategies to facilitate permitting, identify recommended technical studies, and identify mitigation opportunities. If any mitigation options are identified, including wetlands and surface waters, wildlife and habitat, and water resources, they are recorded in the applicable section of the programming screen summary report. Overall, this process provides a basis for the level of environmental analysis and coordination needed during the PD&E study. For the permit coordinator, the summary report will identify the level of agency coordination anticipated during PD&E, such as formal or informal Section 7 Endangered Species Act consultation for listed species, and what issues the permit coordinator should track during the PD&E in preparation for permitting. Regardless of whether a project has been screened through the environmental screening tool, environmental permits may be required. Agency ETAT responses are only at a level of detail corresponding to the information provided for the project, which tends to be more general during the planning phase. Impacts requiring permitting may not be fully realized until the project reaches the design phase. Lesson 6 focuses on the procedures that occur during the planning phase and PD&E study. The Etdm summary reports and the ETAT Input from the permitting and resource agencies should be used to prepare the framework for developing the PD&E scope of services, focus PD&E analysis, and anticipate projects' permitting needs. Coordination with the agencies should be maintained throughout the PD&E study on specific project issues such as considering avoidance, minimization, and mitigation measures, coordinating environmental commitments, receiving agency concurrences, and documenting permitting requirements. Agency coordination should be documented in the project file in the statewide environmental project tracker called SWEPT. SWEPT includes an environmental permits module that allows the district permit coordinators to track permitting information. The Etdm Programming Screen Summary Report provides comments from the regulatory agencies on the natural resources within the project area, including air quality, coastal and marine systems, contaminated sites, navigation, water resources, wetlands, wildlife and habitat, historic and archaeological, recreational areas, and Section 4F. In addition, the Etdm Programming Screen Summary Report contains an anticipated permits section. The review of this report will provide guidance on the types of issues and permits that need to be addressed or further evaluated during the PD&E study. Information gathered during the PD&E study supports the initial permitting of the project. The PD&E impact assessment should be focused on the ETAT agency's comments in the Etdm programming screening. This includes assessing listed species, anticipated impacts, and any opportunities for mitigation that are recommended by the ETAT. During the PD&E study, agency coordination continues, including confirming only modified methodology, including impact assessments, functional analysis, and species protocols. A report called a Natural Resources Evaluation, or NRE, is developed during the PD&E study when needed. The report quantifies potential protected species, wetland and other surface waters, and essential fish habitat impacts, discusses avoidance and minimization measures, identifies mitigation options, discusses agency coordination, addresses ETAT agency comments, and updates the anticipated permits list. See FDOT's NRE outline and guidance document for more information on how to prepare an NRE. This document is available on OEM's website. The NRE should be submitted to OEM for review for federal projects. NREs for state-funded projects are not required to be reviewed by OEM. Once OEM comments are addressed, the NRE is finalized and submitted to the applicable resource agency for coordination or consultation as appropriate. The NRE, as well as the environmental document, should include avoidance, minimization, and mitigation measures to demonstrate to the agencies that FDOT is working to address impacts. Mitigation for unavoidable impacts is required pursuant to 33 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 325 and 332, 40 CFR, Part 230, and Section 373.4137 Florida statutes. This applies to permits issued under the State 404 program as well. Coordinate with agencies to determine whether the wetland mitigation proposed also satisfies the mitigation needs for wetland-dependent listed species, such as the wood stork. FDOT needs to ensure that mitigation options are available, cost-effective, and technologically feasible prior to advancing the project to final design. Review the FDOT Mitigation Payment Processing Handbook for more information on mitigation options, including purchasing mitigation credits or funding water management district services. Section 373.4137 of the Florida statutes states that mitigation options may include the use of mitigation banks and any other mitigation options that satisfy state and federal requirements. For example, mitigation bank credit purchases, funding to water management districts for mitigation services, and FDOT responsible mitigation projects. The Conceptual Mitigation Plan is prepared in accordance with Part 2, Chapter 9 of the PD&E Manual. The plan must contain the level of mitigation detail determined through agency coordination, as well as demonstrate that the mitigation is available to offset the proposed impacts. The permit coordinator should assist with the preparation and/or review of the conceptual mitigation plan and the mitigation discussion included within the supporting documents. Commitments developed during PD&E provide assurance to the reviewing agencies that issues identified will be appropriately addressed during design and permitting. FDOT should not create commitments that are already required by regulation, too broad or not project-specific, unnecessary, or that are standard practices. Be sure to coordinate commitments with other FDOT offices to ensure they are in agreement. Document all commitments in the environmental document and track commitments per FDOT's Project Commitment Tracking Procedure and Part 1, Chapter 22 of the PD&E Manual. The environmental document must outline anticipated permits. Permits that were identified during the Etdm process that are no longer applicable should also be included with an explanation as to why they are no longer required. Regulatory agency coordination that has taken place to date must be included in the swept project file. Permits are recorded in the environmental document in a similar manner for Type 2 categorical exclusions, environmental assessments, environmental impact statements, and state environmental impact reports. Permits are listed in the Anticipated Permits section. They are also discussed in the Applicable Environmental Analysis subsection as part of the discussion of coordination with the resource agencies requiring the permit. This may include wetlands and other surface waters, essential fish habitat, protected species and habitat, and/or the navigation subsections. Further guidance on documenting this information is provided for each environmental document in Part 1 of the PD&E Manual. Permits that will be needed for the project are also listed in the executive summary of the Draft Environmental Impact Statement, or DEIS, in a subsection titled List of Other Government Actions Required. More information on this can be found in Part 1, Chapter 8 of the PD&E Manual. In the rare chance that a final environmental impact statement, or FEIS, is prepared separately from the Record of Decision, or ROD, they are also listed in the Executive Summary in a subsection titled Other Government Actions and Permits Required. For RODs, the ROD replaces the Executive Summary. For more information on documentation in an FEIS or ROD, see Part 1, Chapter 9 of the PD&E Manual. After a PD&E study has been approved by OEM, it must be reevaluated in accordance with Part 1, Chapter 13 of the PD&E Manual. Reevaluations ensure that the decisions made during PD&E or the previous project phase are still valid. Specific to permitting, the reevaluation should address changes in federal and state laws, rules, or regulations since the approval of the environmental document that may impact permitting. Design changes, such as changes in typical section, shifts in roadway alignment, changes in right-of-way requirements, and changes in drainage requirements, may require changes to anticipated permits and associated mitigation, or even require additional permits. During the reevaluation process, design changes that affect wetland mitigation strategies, wildlife and habitat, and archaeological and historic resources are also assessed. The permit coordinator will provide the district environmental office with any wetland, benthic, or species surveys conducted in the design phase for documentation in the reevaluation. The permit coordinator also provides documentation of any agency consultation, such as Section 7 Endangered Species Act documents, a list of permits with issuance and expiration dates, mitigation status, as well as commitment status updates related to natural resources. In some districts, the environmental office will conduct the natural resources surveys or species consultation. In this case, the environmental office and permit coordinator will coordinate to ensure both the reevaluation and permit applications are complete and consistent. A reevaluation form is prepared and swept to document any project changes captured in the reevaluation review. Permitting information should be included in the Status of Permits section of the reevaluation form. Lesson 7 focuses on the procedures during design and permitting, design build versus design bid build projects, the local agency program, key permitting application information required, the pre-application process, and permit application submittal. The purpose of the design phase is to refine the project design initiated in the PD&E, or preliminary design concepts. The design phase includes such actions as finalizing the alignment, further avoiding and minimizing impacts, and, if unavoidable impacts exist, determining a specific mitigation plan for the agencies. In addition, federal and state permits are typically applied for at Phase 2 design plans or 60% design plans in order to authorize construction. Lastly, plans are generated with specifications consistent with permit allowances and conditions. It is critical that the permit coordinator, environmental staff, and the design team refer to the information prepared during the PD&E study, such as the environmental document, technical reports, such as an NRE or Cultural Resources Assessment Survey report, agency correspondence, and commitments to incorporate agency input, design considerations, and project commitments into the project design and related permit application packages. A handoff meeting between the environmental office, the PD&E project manager, the design project manager, the design team, and the permit coordinator is recommended to ensure this information is discussed and key issues are addressed. From the planning phase to the design and construction phases, projects generally follow one of two project delivery methods, design bid build or design build. The design bid build process is a form of project delivery where FDOT either performs the design work in-house or negotiates with an engineering design firm to prepare drawings and specifications under a design services contract, and then separately contracts for construction services by engaging a contractor through competitive bidding. The design-build process is when the design and construction are done by a single selected design-build team. FDOT may obtain permits or conceptual permits prior to design-build award, or the design-build firm may be responsible for obtaining the permits. The design-build firm is also responsible for obtaining any permit modifications required for their design through coordination with the FDOT Permit Coordinator and the Environmental Office. The difference between design bid build versus design build processes from a permitting perspective is the timing of permit acquisition. Design bid build projects are awarded with completed permits, which are issued prior to letting. On design build projects, conceptual or construction permits may be acquired by FDOT prior to letting, but may be modified by the design build team based on design changes proposed during the alternative technical concept process. Otherwise, the permitting effort is assigned as part of the design build team's scope of services. A project's contract letting date is the date the FDOT opens bid proposals from potential contractors. Examples of design changes proposed during this process include reducing bridge spans, alternative drainage design, or a change in interchange concepts. During this vetting process, FDOT and the design team must understand which activities the issued permits authorize in relation to stormwater criteria, wetland impacts, and listed species effects, and which design changes would require permit modifications. Additional impacts to wetlands raise concerns, including whether additional mitigation is available or whether the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or Corps, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection or FDEP, or the Water Management District would authorize additional impacts, given that the previous design demonstrated avoidance and minimization of these impacts. Commitments made during the PD&E study should also be followed closely when considering alternative technical concept proposals. especially given the extensive public involvement conducted prior to finalization of the PD&E documents. A change in an interchange concept could require extensive coordination and additional approvals and/or public involvement through the NEPA process. For local agency program or LAP projects not on the state highway system, the LAP agency is responsible for all permitting activities, including application preparation and signature, and mitigation execution. FDOT may provide the LAP agency with oversight through the LAP coordinator to assure completeness. For more information on the LAP process, refer to FDOT's Local Agency Program Manual. Permit application and process resources are available through the Permit Handbook and Part 1, Chapter 12 of the PD&E Manual. See Figure 12-1 for federal permitting resources and Figure 12-2 for state permitting resources. In order to complete the permit application and comply with NEPA, FDOT will need to gather and finalize all necessary data. This may include conducting alignment-specific or updated environmental surveys as warranted by the design and time elapsed since approval of the environmental document. This may involve conducting protected species surveys, wetland and surface water jurisdictional determinations, wetland impacts, and mitigation need assessments. Applicable water table elevation determinations, cultural resources delineations or documentation, as well as identification of other sensitive resources such as seagrasses, mangroves, corals, benthic resources, and essential fish habitat. In addition, FDOT will need to reinitiate and/or finalize consultations such as Section 7 or Section 10 under the Endangered Species Act, the Essential Fish Habitat or benthic surveys, wetland jurisdictional and mitigation methodology, and present the mitigation reserved or acquired. FDOT will need to develop drainage requirements such as improvements to stormwater drainage system, state water quality and quantity criteria, and erosion and sediment control plans. For more information on drainage development, refer to Part 2, Chapter 11, Water Resources, and Part 2, Chapter 13, Floodplains, of the PD&E Manual, as well as the FDOT Drainage Manual. Results of updated environmental surveys, studies, drainage details, and agency coordination/consultations should be performed in coordination with the District Environmental Office and documented in the reevaluation. Mitigation activities performed during design and permitting may include implementation of avoidance and minimization measures, finalizing the mitigation approach, identifying the mitigation quantities, such as wetlands, mangroves, seagrasses, essential fish habitat, listed species, and critical habitat, and the amount of federal and state credits, completing agency coordination and/or consultation, and ensuring that mitigation is incorporated as an environmental permit condition. To facilitate project permitting, a pre-application conference should be scheduled to discuss the project and related requirements with the appropriate state or federal agency. These conferences are in addition to resource agency coordination during the Etdm process and PD&E study. They are meant to notify agency personnel of the pending application, establish agency expectations of application content, and identify project-specific issues that should be addressed in the application. Federal and state permit application packages are typically initiated when design approaches Phase 2 design plans at 60% design plans. Application packages may be generated in-house by the district or by consultants. If prepared by a consultant, packages are reviewed, approved, and signed by the permit coordinator or their designee, since FDOT is responsible for the project. The use of an application checklist is recommended. Timing is directed by the permit coordinator in coordination with the design project manager and the program management office. This ensures that design, permitting, and construction are appropriately scheduled and funded to avoid extended periods between permit issuance and construction funding. The core permit applications for projects in retained waters should be submitted utilizing Form ENG 4345. The form and instructions are available on the core website. There is no permit fee for government agencies. FDOT districts submit application packages directly to the U.S. Coast Guard or Coast Guard. The Coast Guard Bridge Permit Application Guide details typical Coast Guard application package contents. Also, there is no permit fee for government agencies. More information on the U.S. Coast Guard permitting process can be found in Part 1, Chapter 16 of the PD&E Manual. For projects in state-assumed waters, permit applications are submitted to FDEP. For projects where a State 404 general permit is required, FDOT prepares and submits Form 62-330.4021, Notice of Intent to Use an Environmental Resource and/or State 404 Program General Permit. For projects requiring a State 404 individual permit, FDOT prepares and submits Form 62-330.0601, Application for Individual and Conceptual Approval Environmental Resource Permit, State 404 Program Permit, and Authorization to Use State-Owned Submerged Lands. The permit coordinator, with assistance from the environmental manager, should coordinate with the DEP. FDOT permit applications for ERPs are to be submitted to the Water Management District or FDEP. FDOT districts may submit the natural resources evaluation as supporting data, along with any updated information within the application. FDEP or Water Management District will examine the application or notice to use a general permit to determine whether the project involves state-owned submerged lands. When necessary, FDEP or Water Management District staff will request a title determination from FDEP's Division of State Lands as confirmation on whether state lands would be affected. Activities within a state aquatic preserve must receive a separate written authorization prior to initiating work. Refer to the Water Management District or FDEP websites for current permit-specific application fees. FDOT will submit the Coastal Construction Control Line, or CCCL, permit application directly to the FDEP Coastal Construction Control Line program. An application for a permit for construction seaward of the Coastal Construction Control Line, or 50-foot setback, is required. Refer to Rule 62B-33.008 FAC, Permit Application Requirements and Procedures, for more information on the application process. To identify permit-specific application fees, refer to FDEP's website. To learn more, go to the Permit Handbook Appendix on CCCL. The Erosion and Sediment Control Plan is submitted as part of the Environmental Resources Permit application. It provides reasonable assurance that water quality standards will not be violated during construction. The plan must identify the location, relative timing, and specifications for all erosion and sediment control and stabilization measures to be implemented during construction. In addition, it must provide for compliance with the terms and schedule of implementing the project. To learn more, refer to Volume 1 of the Applicant's Handbook and Part 1 of the State of Florida Erosion and Sediment Control Designer and Reviewer Manual. A Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, or SWIP, is required to meet National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, requirements. It applies to all FDOT projects which disturb 1 or more acres of total land area and discharges to waters of the United States. The objective of the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan is to prevent erosion where construction activities are occurring, prevent pollutants from mixing with stormwater, and prevent pollutants from being discharged by trapping them on site before they can affect the receiving waters. To learn more, see Part 2, Section 251 of the FDOT Design Manual. The Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, or SWIP, is prepared in consultation with drainage, construction, and environmental personnel and includes SWIP plan sheets and documents referenced by the SWIP sheets, contractors' approved erosion control plan, standard specification section 104, inspection reports, and documentation of field changes implemented to better address the objectives. The SWIP developed for the Environmental Resources Permit may not fulfill NPDES requirements. Therefore, FDOT's contractor is responsible for developing a project-specific SWIP to meet the NPDES regulatory requirements prior to construction. To learn more, see FDOT's Design Manual, Part 3, Section 320. The project manager and permit coordinator should coordinate during permitting. Federal permitting authority typically originates from proposed impacts to jurisdictional wetlands and other surface waters, or from bridge or causeway construction over navigable waters of the United States. The Corps regulates discharge of dredged and fill material into waters of the United States, including wetlands for projects in retained waters. The Coast Guard administers the permitting program for bridge and causeway construction. In Lesson 8, guidance is provided for post-permit issuance responsibilities, as well as procedures for complying with permit conditions, implementing mitigation and monitoring activities, seeking permit extensions and/or modifications, tracking permits, and enforcement. All permit conditions and project commitments must be tracked during construction to ensure compliance with the environmental permits. FDOT is responsible for compliance of environmental concerns during the construction and maintenance phases. This includes identifying other commitments developed in previous phases of the project that may not be incorporated in the permits. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service biological opinion, an agreement for archaeological or historical resources, and PD&E commitments. The construction project administrator is required to coordinate with the permit coordinator and other designated environmental compliance staff to ensure all work is completed in accordance with the permit conditions. Permit compliance is one of the primary responsibilities of the contractor. However, as the permit holder, FDOT is also responsible for complying with the terms and conditions. See the FDOT Project Commitment Tracking Procedure, Part 2, Chapter 22 of the PD&E Manual, and the Construction Project Administration Manual, or CPAM, for more information. Permits include a set of conditions. Permit coordinators must read all permit conditions for every permit issued and coordinate with appropriate offices to address unusual permit conditions before project letting. The Environmental Resources Permit, or ERP, contains a set of standard conditions, and the Dredge and Fill Permit includes a set of general conditions, most of which are procedural in nature. The State of Florida ERP general conditions are taken from Rule 62-330.405, whereas Dredge and Fill general conditions are taken from 33 CFR sections 320 through 330. All the standard and general conditions are binding to FDOT and enforceable under the regulations of the governing authority. Specific conditions are unique to the individual project and are as variable as the different road and bridge projects that exist throughout the state. It is especially important to note the specific conditions for each project, as these conditions set the limits of the authorization and therefore define when enforcement actions may be warranted. Specific conditions must be followed by FDOT and the contractor, or the project may be stopped or fined. Generally, FDOT uses Construction Engineering and Inspection, or CEI, guidelines to ensure permit compliance. If any conditions of the permit are not acceptable, the issue must be resolved prior to the initiation of any work. Specific permit conditions address measures to prevent water quality violations, implement mitigation to offset wetland impacts, monitor activities to avoid impacts to listed species or habitat, and employ specific construction techniques to avoid or minimize impacts to wetlands. Other conditions may exist as determined by agencies to address specific project impacts. Generally, dewatering permits are issued to the contractor, who is then responsible to have them renewed if the operation goes beyond the allocated time period. However, the CEI should be aware of the permit's conditions and timeframe to make sure they are being followed. Dewatering permits are usually obtained just prior to work commencing. The timeframe immediately prior to the start of construction is a crucial stage in project compliance and requires an understanding of what is not authorized by the permit. These construction commencement conditions include any requirements triggered by the start of construction. State-issued ERPs require the submittal of a construction commencement notice at least 48 hours prior to construction. This is typically done by the contractor with oversight from the CEI. Rule 62-330.350 FAC requires that the permittee fill out the construction commencement notice form at least 48 hours prior to starting work. This form is generally submitted to the Water Management District via e-permitting or emailed to FDEP. U.S. Army Corps General Permit conditions require a commencement notification within 10 days from the date of initiating the work authorized by the permit. This notification is submitted by the contractor with oversight of the CEI. Note that some permits also require a pre-construction meeting between FDOT contractors and regulatory agencies to review permit conditions and ensure a clear understanding of the permit requirements by all parties. Once a project is nearing the end of construction, the permit coordinator, construction project administrator, CEI team, and the contractor superintendent typically coordinate on closing out permit conditions and project commitments. The construction project administrator, or CEI, is responsible for submitting the permit closeout documentation to the agencies. However, the permit coordinator must confirm that all permit requirements are complete and the project documents are retained for the record. Both state and federal agencies require as-builts or post-construction submittal of completed plans to confirm what was built matches what was originally permitted. The Corps requires a self-certification form within 60 days of completion of the work. All deviations in the project must be detailed. If differences exist, contact the Corps to determine if a permit modification is required. FDEP requires a certification of compliance with the State 404 Program General Permit form to be completed within 30 days of construction completion. The state requires notifications of the completed plans as well as transfer of the construction permit to the operational phase within 30 days of construction completion. The as-builts are to be signed and sealed. Note that final inspections will likely be required with agency personnel to close out the permits. In addition, it is recommended that the permit coordinator review all conditions in the issued permits for the project, as well as any project commitments, to ensure that nothing is being overlooked. Many permits require that post-construction maintenance activities be conducted. If this is required, it will be documented in the project-specific conditions within the permit. Examples of activities that may be conditioned for project maintenance are stormwater management facilities, such as ponds, swales, drainage structures, and monitoring of mitigation sites. The maintenance office and the permit coordinator are responsible for continuous coordination to ensure both parties understand what scheduling information and other pertinent details are needed to implement and track the permit conditions applicable to the maintenance phase. In some FDOT districts, the permit coordinator is responsible for assisting the permit compliance during the maintenance phase. Mitigation sites associated with a permittee responsible mitigation plan usually include provisions for maintenance activities that must be conducted after the mitigation site has been established. Most mitigation sites require maintenance events to prevent the spread of nuisance and exotic vegetation. These maintenance events are typically conducted more frequently during the growing season, with less frequent events occurring in the late fall and winter months. The number and frequency of maintenance events, as conditioned in the permit, will depend on the type of mitigation being conducted and the site characteristics. Properly executed maintenance events may help the mitigation site achieve the success criteria within shorter timeframes and can avoid the need to extend the maintenance for longer than originally permitted. Site-specific conditions may warrant other types of maintenance, such as maintaining hydrology connections, fencing, and trash. FDOT maintenance is required in perpetuity unless agreements are in place with the water management district, county, or city. To ensure the successful creation, enhancement, or restoration of wetlands, any permittee responsible mitigation sites will have permit conditions that address monitoring throughout mitigation construction and after the mitigation activities have been completed. During construction, the contractor must follow all elements of the mitigation plan as authorized by the permit. It is critical for the contractor, CEI, and FDOT to evaluate site-specific conditions observed during construction and make appropriate adjustments to ensure mitigation plan goals are met. Mitigation sites are often located adjacent to environmentally sensitive areas. Construction of a mitigation site is no different than any other construction project. Therefore, it is very important for the contractor to be aware of the site conditions and follow any applicable permit conditions. If earthwork is required for the mitigation plan, conditions typically require FDOT to submit mitigation as-builts to the permitting agencies for review, comment, and approval once the final grades are achieved. The as-built approval for earthworks occurs prior to planting the site. This is an important step to ensure that the agencies are satisfied with the final grades. Failure to obtain approval from the agencies could result in the need to remove plants and regrade the site and replant the vegetation, all of which may be time-consuming and costly. Minor design changes may be incorporated into the plan and noted when the as-builts are submitted to the agencies upon completion of the mitigation. Monitoring activities would include reporting to the agencies on the agreed-upon success criteria, including monitoring the spread of nuisance and exotic vegetation and survival of desirable species. The first report is termed the Time Zero Report and forms the basis of all future monitoring. Mitigation monitoring is typically required for a 5-year period to demonstrate that the mitigation area is functioning as designed. The monitoring period may be decreased or increased based on achievement of success criteria. An agency sign-off letter is provided to FDOT once the agencies have agreed that all success criteria have been achieved. The agency sign-off letter needs to be placed in the project file for FDOT's records. Do not assume agencies will keep sign-off letters, as agency staff change and records can be lost. Note that the release of mitigation credits from regulatory agencies for permittee responsible mitigation sites is dispersed at certain benchmarks: permit construction, as-builts, and at the end of the monitoring period. When an FDOT construction project is located wholly or partially in water, those construction activities conducted in the water will typically require turbidity monitoring. Additionally, the permits associated with the project will include specific conditions related to water quality. The contractor or the CEI conducts this monitoring. In practice, turbidity readings are taken once in the mid-morning and once in the mid-afternoon to meet the 4-hour schedule requirements. The exception to this schedule is when work occurs during the night. Then additional monitoring is required. The turbidity monitoring results are assembled in a report that is submitted to agencies on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, depending on the permit conditions. The purpose of turbidity monitoring is to determine if turbidity standards are being maintained. If turbidity results indicate an exceedance of state standards, the following actions are usually required by ERP permit conditions. In-water construction must stop. FDOT's construction project administrator must be notified. The regulatory agencies are notified by the contractor. Corrective action is determined and implemented, and agencies are notified of the corrective action. and agencies give approval for resumption of in-water activities. Note that there are several other monitoring and testing procedures related to the maintenance of state water quality standards that may be required by the state ERP or by the Corps or state dredge and fill permit. Examples of these procedures include groundwater testing, soils testing, and testing of waters from dewatering operations. The important point is that the contractor must be aware of all testing and monitoring activities that are required by the issued permits. Contractors for FDOT projects that include a Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, or SWIP, generally include National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES, trained inspectors as part of the construction team. These inspectors are responsible for the proper implementation of the SWIP. In addition, NPDES inspectors may be required to oversee the erosion and turbidity controls in accordance with the Construction Project Administration Manual. The FDEP provides an excellent series of NPDES inspector training events throughout Florida. The training typically lasts for 2 days and concludes with a test. As part of the NPDES permit, inspectors are required to monitor all turbidity and erosion control devices at least once a week and after each rain event greater than 1/2 of an inch. The inspector is required to prepare a report after each inspection and maintain a log of all reports. FDEP may periodically inspect the site and require a copy of this log for their review. In addition to preparing the report, the inspector is required to identify any failures of the turbidity and erosion control systems to the contractor. Any identified failures of these controls should be immediately remedied by the contractor with all corrective actions described. These corrections and the date of the correction must be part of the logbook. Lastly, a notice of termination must be submitted to FDEP when all the work that requires monitoring has been completed. Many state-issued ERP permits include specific conditions for the monitoring of state-listed species. Similarly, the Section 404 dredge and fill permit may include monitoring or other specific conditions related to federal or state-listed species. Several threatened or endangered species occur throughout the state, including coral species on bridges in South Florida, sand skinks on the ridge in Central Florida, and listed mussels in Northwest Florida. Permit-specific conditions are therefore quite variable, since they are dependent on project location and species present in the area. A few of the common conditions for listed species are detailed in the appendices in the Permit Handbook. They include state and federal permits often include standard manatee construction conditions as part of the specific conditions for any in-water work in water bodies accessible to the manatee. Eastern indigo snake standard conditions are included in core permits where the projects are authorized and include habitats where the eastern indigo snake may be found. Several aquatic listed species have a set of specific construction conditions included in the dredge and fill permit. These species include sea turtles, small-toothed sawfish, and sturgeon. There are many other listed species for which monitoring may be required as conditions in state or federal permits. This monitoring is generally focused on nesting surveys, but may include other surveying responsibilities as well. These surveys have a specified seasonal requirement, nesting requirements, and survey protocol, so it is critical that the contractor have qualified observers on their team that can perform the species survey using required protocols. Examples include Audubon's crested caracara seasonal nesting survey requirements and sand skink survey protocol. All state ERPs and Section 404 dredge and fill standard permits include a general condition prescribing actions that must occur if archaeological or cultural remains are uncovered during construction activities for an FDOT project. Generally, the following actions are required. Construction activities in the area of the discovery must cease. Contractor or design build team notifies the FDOT project manager. The FDOT Permit Coordinator, in coordination with the District Cultural Resources Coordinator, notifies the Florida Department of State Division of Historical Resources, and the Florida Department of State provides direction on required activities. For projects where the PD&E study identified the presence of archaeological or historic resources, the state ERP and/or the Corps or state dredge and fill permit may also contain a set of specific conditions. These conditions identify any actions that FDOT is required to perform when constructing in the vicinity of an archaeological or cultural resources. If a PD&E study was not performed, any archaeological or historic resources present in the project corridor will be identified during the permit application process. FDOT's Construction Project Administrator will inform the contractor of these requirements. In addition, the presence of a professional archaeological observer may be required when construction is ongoing in the areas where archaeological resources were identified previously. All issued permits include a specified duration for completion of the permitted activities. No work authorized by the permit may be conducted after the permit has expired, regardless of the project's progress. The permit expiration date is listed on the first page of the permit, and the duration for standard or individual permits is typically 5 years from the date of issuance. Note that Coast Guard bridge permits specify that the permit becomes null and void unless construction of the bridge is commenced and completed by certain dates. This time period is usually 3 years and 5 years respectively from the date of the permit. Nationwide permits issued by the Corps expire every 5 years and must then go through a reauthorization process. If work was not started prior to the expiration of the nationwide permit, a new nationwide permit must be obtained before work can start. Note that nationwide permits let you keep working for 1 additional year to complete the project as authorized if construction for the project was initiated prior to the expiration of the nationwide permit. Permit extensions may be granted for most projects by requesting a permit modification. Each FDOT office maintains a tracking mechanism for identifying the expiration dates of permits. Generally, FDOT's permit coordinator submits the request for the extension of the permit expiration date. It is important to request the extension well in advance of the permit expiration date, since the extension request must be processed by the regulatory staff in a manner consistent with any other modification request. The staff should specify the period of time necessary to complete the project, so a new expiration date can be set. Note that state general permits, federal or regional general permits, and nationwide permits cannot be extended beyond the expiration date. If work as authorized by these types of permits is not completed by the expiration date, a new authorization must be obtained. All federal and nationwide permits are issued on a 5-year basis, and therefore all expire on the same date. Current nationwide permits will expire on March 18, 2022. When a nationwide permit is issued, the expiration date is clearly identified. If construction on a project authorized by a nationwide permit has begun prior to the expiration date of the permit, FDOT has an additional year to complete the project. Many FDOT projects are permitted during the design phase prior to the project's advancement to construction. When changes to the project design are proposed after permitting has already been completed, modifications of issued permits can be processed with the regulatory agencies to authorize the required changes. Depending on the level of deviation from the issued permits, the changes can be handled with a simple letter request and supporting information for such a minor modification, or by submitting a revised project information as if it were a new application, such as a major modification. Examples of a minor modification would include such things as a change of ownership or operational control, change of frequency of monitoring or reporting, and a correction of typographical errors. A major modification would include such things as major design modifications, substitutions, or functional alternatives. Regardless of the level of change, it is important to contact the appropriate agency and discuss the project changes as early as possible to allow reasonable time for the agency's permit modification review. FDOT districts utilize internal systems to track permits issued for projects. They use the Permit Transmittal Memorandum to distribute permits to FDOT personnel and offices, such as the project manager, program management, construction, maintenance, and specifications. Permits are made available to potential contractors via FDOT's File Transfer Protocol site. In addition, SWEPT includes an environmental permits module that allows the district permit coordinators to track permitting information, including applications, requests for additional information, issued permits, and mitigation requirements. It can also create the Permit Transmittal Memorandum. FDOT staff also implement measures to track the completion of tasks associated with each permit, such as pre-construction wildlife surveys, the implementation of mitigation activities or credit purchases, the protection of resources during construction, the dates of permit expiration, schedules for inspections or monitoring events, and notification or self-certifications after construction is complete. Spreadsheets and/or databases may be helpful, especially when the tracking tools automatically notify the user of upcoming dates and scheduled events. A commitment module in Project Suite Enterprise Edition has been created to document, transmit, and track all commitments established as a result of the PD&E study and/or agency coordination. The PD&E project manager must enter all commitments into the commitment module in accordance with FDOT's project commitment tracking procedure. The commitment module will then be used to transfer these commitments to the design project manager for future tracking. Even with well-designed plans, unintended consequences that can lead to unauthorized wetland or protected species impacts or water quality violations, or otherwise result in a situation that is not in compliance with issued permits. Voluntary notification is an important consideration when environmental and regulatory agencies coordinate with permittees to develop solutions to any noncompliance event. The identification and development of immediate solutions are equally important for resolving the cause of the noncompliance and for implementing corrective actions as soon as possible. Interagency coordination is typically recommended prior to the implementation of any corrective actions, since some solutions may require approval by regulatory agencies. In the highly unlikely event that a voluntary informal solution to a violation cannot be reached, each regulatory agency has established procedures for pursuing judicial actions. Sections 309 and 404 of the Clean Water Act give the Environmental Protection Agency and the Corps the authority to take judicial enforcement actions for violations of federal rules. The authority for the water management districts and FDEP is granted in Chapter 373 Florida statutes. Keep in mind that anyone who knowingly violates water quality criteria, the wetland requirements of a Section 404 permit, or the ERP criteria in Section 373 Florida statutes, may also be subject to criminal liability. For the state agencies, the activity-based split described in the delegation of authority for the review of ERP applications, such as Water Management District versus FDEP administration, also includes a section on the responsibilities for enforcement compliance reviews. Before initiating an administrative or judicial proceeding against an alleged violator, the regulatory agency has the responsibility to conduct an investigation that may include on-site inspection, sample collection, review of records, and/or monitoring to determine that the agency has jurisdiction and that a violation has occurred. Whenever substantial damage has been caused, or may occur if the condition is not corrected, data establishing those facts must be gathered. Depending on the results of this investigation, the case can then lead to a formal enforcement process and ultimately to civil or criminal proceedings. Both the state and the federal government utilize penalty matrices, identifying potential costs for any resolution that results from this process. Should the district find themselves in a situation involving judicial action, the district management and Office of General Counsel should be informed as soon as possible. The Office of Environmental Management maintains a Documents and Publications website that contains all relevant manuals, handbooks, guidelines, and agreements. Key references pertinent to this training include Environmental Management Academy Course Catalog, which is in FDOT's Learning Curve. The Environmental Management Academy Course Catalog is also available through the OEM PD&E training track. Other resources include FDOT's Project Development and Environment Manual, Efficient Transportation Decision-Making Manual, FDOT's Project Commitment Tracking Procedure, and FDOT's NRE Outline and Guidance document. Links to other resources mentioned in this training can be found in the Permit Handbook.